not easy.
This one's really interesting. We're going to talk about something that a lot of people just don't like in Scripture. And so we're going to dive into it and talk about why it's interesting and maybe connect that to some other things. So, yeah. As I'm talking, maybe think about some other things that you would want to add to it as well. Think about things that you're connecting it to, because I want to hear kind of where you're going with it too. Hear me?
Okay.
Cool. All right. All right, so the next one, we're going to go back to Genesis. I don't know, I just had a thing for Genesis this time, but I do love Genesis overall. There's just so many really cool stories and really cool things to dive into. We're going to chapter 5 because we're going to talk about our favorite thing, genealogies.
Oh.
So genealogies, I know a lot of people are just super bored by them. People that read the Bible for the first time, they're like, what is happening right now? But I hope we explained to you today why genealogies are just super important and why these things are just so cool to dive into. This is just one example of many that we could dive into when it comes to genealogies and different things that appear in them overall. In church right now, we're doing a series through the book of John, and so we were kind of going, or Matthew, sorry, that's mixed up. The book of Matthew, and we're talking about the genealogies that Matthew puts at the beginning of the book, and it's so funny because our pastor was like, yeah, we're going to spend like the next year on these genealogies, just going through them. Obviously we didn't, but definitely could spend a lot of time in the genealogies there. So we're not going to read through all the genealogies from Adam to Noah, but we are going to start near the end on verse 21. So starting with Enoch here. Enoch had lived 65 years, and then he fathered Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after he had fathered Methuselah for 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. So Enoch kind of took him away. Enoch was taken away by God, which is interesting. We don't really get a ton of information on that, but Enoch is pretty dope. Then we go to Methuselah, his son. Methuselah had lived 187 years. He fathered Lamech. Methuselah lived after he fathered Lamech for 782 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days of Methuselah were 969, and he died. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he fathered a son, and he called his name Noah. Now, there's a specific point about Noah in this verse. He says, he called him Noah, saying, out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from the painful toil of our hands. Lamech lived after he had fathered Noah 595 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days of Lamech were 777. So that's what we're going to stick to right now, and then we'll start on some later stuff here in a second. But so we get all those names and numbers, right? Like they lived this long, they had this person, then they lived the rest of their days, they had other sons and daughters, and then they kept on moving on, right? Then they moved on to the next person, next person, next person. So we have Enoch, which is obviously a massive kind of figure here, one of the only people to like not die, right? He went up to heaven with God somehow. Don't really know how that works, but cool. And then his son's name is Methuselah, right? Which is an interesting name. And then we see Methuselah fathers Lamech, Lamech fathers Noah. So we have this generation, right? These like 4 generations of people that we kind of get numbers for exactly. Now, when does the flood come for Noah? Do you know?
When he was like 600.
Yeah, so 600 years old is how old Noah was when the flood comes, okay? So the flood wipes out everybody but Noah's family, right?
Right.
And so Noah is 600. And if we use the numbers of the genealogy, this becomes very, very interesting.
Right.
So if we go back 600 years, so Noah is 600, we go back 600 years, and then we add the numbers from when Noah was born to when Lamech was born, then to when Methuselah was born. This equals an exact number, like a very exact number. Do you know what that number is?
969. 369. I don't know. What are you saying?
Yes, 969. So 600 plus 182 plus 187 equals 969, okay? So what does this mean for us? It means that exactly 969 years before the flood came, Methuselah was born, okay? So that exact year, Methuselah was born. Now, I know this is not interesting yet, but I promise, just stick with us. This is where it gets really interesting. Methuselah, okay, his name could mean a few different things, okay? So his name means man of the dart or javelin, okay? That's like one interpretation of it. Another interpretation could be his death shall bring forth, or man of the sending, okay? So another interpretation of this, and I like to say it this way, is when he dies, it will come. Or when he dies, it will happen. And so the interpretation of Methuselah's name, if it's when he dies, it will happen, and then exactly when he dies is the year that the flood comes, it's like it's just so cool to think about the genealogies and things that God could be teaching us through these specific motifs, right? Mm-hmm. Not that it's like this massive, like over the top, like this is going to save you, this is the perfect thing ever, like you need to know this sort of moment, but it's like God intentionally did this. Mm-hmm. Like there's a reason why Methuselah died intentionally on that year, right?
Yeah.
Maybe even more specifically on that date, right? Like we don't know.
Right.
But there's a reason why all of that happened. And for Noah to grow up knowing that his grandfather's name was when he dies it will happen, like I don't know, you know? And then also knowing that Noah's name is tied to this phrase that his father said, right? That through all the times that we toil and all the stuff that we're dealing with here, this one will bring us relief. Like all of those things are tied together, right? It's not a coincidence. It's not just like this random thing. And so it's just so cool to think about all of these different things coming together. And then I begin to think about other genealogies. Like what other genealogies are interesting that we could think about when it comes to scripture. I think obviously the first one I think of is Christ.
Right.
Right? And all the people that are in his genealogy. The people that are just jacked up. And why specific people would be added into those genealogies. Like why would they talk about the specific women that they talked about in Jesus' genealogy? Like Ruth or Rahab, right? Like these are not like perfect people. Like sure they have cool stories and stuff, but like Rahab is a prostitute, right? Like I don't know. It's just really, really interesting. What do you think about genealogies overall? Did they scare you? Did you like, especially when you first became a Christian, like, is this something you avoided?
Yeah, they were boring. They were boring, the begots and the begoobs.
Yeah, the begoobs,
yeah, and sometimes it's hard to follow. Like I was reading First Chronicles something or other the other day, and it was like, but I know now, like, it's interesting because now I know that genealogies are so important, and to read them and to see what's going on, but it's still like, I don't want to, you know, like it's still like,
I mean, they're insanely important for the Jewish people, right?
100%.
Because you need to know your lineage. Like, you need to know what tribe you're from. You need to know where your ancestors came from, where they were thousands of years ago, essentially, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's very important for you in Jewish culture to understand what tribe you're from and how that fits into who you are. And, you know, how you, like, if you're a Levi, that's the only tribe that could be Levitical priests, right? Like, so there's certain things that are very, very important for these tribes. But not only that, but again, it comes back to like God is giving us evidence after evidence after evidence because we end up finding these specific people that are named, right, in these genealogies. And it helps us to have these logical responses and these just beautiful moments when it comes to scripture. You know what else would be beautiful from you is if you would help us to grow this channel and this podcast. A subscription, a follow, a like, a share, or even rating us 5 stars on the podcast platforms could really, really help us out. Thanks so much. Let's get back to the episode.
Yeah, and even in Matthew, how what's Uriah's wife? Bathsheba. Mm-hmm. Like she wasn't actually named.
Yeah.
Like they just hinted towards who she was.
Sure, yeah. There could be reasons for a lot of that, yeah.
Yeah. It's just also interesting.
Yeah.
And how they used names or letters as numbers.
Yeah. That was another huge thing for sure, is the way in which numbers correlated to letters within the Hebrew lettering. So like, for example, Yahweh has a very specific letter set. David has a very specific letter set. That when you add up the numbers within letters, it equals a very specific number, and then those numbers are used to correlate to very specific things. And so it's always this there's so much more to Scripture than we could ever, I think, imagine. Like we could ever fully understand.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like I always think about this like, there's no one on earth that fully understands the Scripture, right? Mm-hmm. Not to an extent of like, oh yeah, I know every single thing in there, right? Mm-hmm. Like no one would ever claim that because it's so complicated and it's living and it's active and it teaches, right? And there's just so much that God has put in here that we could never ever fully understand it. Mm-hmm. And so, I don't know, the genealogies just make me think of these things in the Bible that, like, man, how much am I missing when I read through this stuff, you know? Not that I don't understand, because I do think that God is very simple, and he wants it to be very simple, but it's also, it has infinite depth, mm-hmm. right? And it has infinite understanding that you can dive into. Mm-hmm. And so for us, like, how do we struggle through that? How do we walk through knowing that it's simple and that it can be plainly read, but also understanding that if we sit with it and chew on it, right, then it becomes more and more and more filling, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know. I just definitely love these parts of the Bible, right? Mm-hmm. I love these parts where it's like, man, God, show me more. Right. You know, like, reveal more to me. Yeah. I want to know more because, like, this is so cool. Like, this is so unique and interesting to know this, you know? It's like when I figure out something about culture that I didn't know before, or historical things with the Jewish people specifically that I didn't know before, or, you know, like, this specific outfit was meant for this, or this specific area was known for this. Like, it helps me so much to understand what is going on in these different things. So, like, I think in Noah's life, like, if they really did understand Methuselah's name as when he dies it will happen, like, they're probably waiting for the day that he's going to die, but he's also the oldest human being ever recorded. So it's like, dude, when are you going to go? You know, like, what's happening there? Yeah. And then Noah also has this saying put upon him from when he's very young of, like, this is the guy that's he's going to give us relief, right? Yeah. And his dad is obviously a prophet to some extent that is kind of saying that, right? Yeah. And so it's like,
but then he doesn't have kids till he's 500.
Mm-hmm, right.
Like, that's interesting too.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. All of it's really interesting to me, but these are the type of things that I get excited about that I think, these are also the things that I think that most people get bored by, which I get. I totally get it. 'Cause I'm not like gearing up to like go read through all the genealogies either. But I do think everything in Scripture is useful for teaching. Yes. And preaching and reproof, and like, you know, like, I do believe that, right? And so this is just a small example of that, but there's so many in Scripture, I think. If you want to check out this full episode, you can do that on patreon.com/thesnipelife. This is the best way to help us to support what we're doing here on the Better Not Easy channel. Thank you very much. Just remember that following Jesus is better not easy.